All right, we're starting on Cuban time tonight, so that's an officially approved not joke from our speaker tonight. I want to thank you all for coming out to this the fifth event of the George Washington Forum. The Washington Forum is a civic education initiative founded on the idea that students facing an increasingly globalized world need to understand what particularly characterizes and distinguishes the nation in which they live and the civilization from which it emerged. Directly allied with its mission to enhance civic education here at Ohio University is an effort to increase the campus's intellectual diversity. At Washington Forum events, you'll hear voices not always heard at this university, and you'll have a chance to debate them directly and civilly. Tonight's lecture to the Forum is made possible primarily by a grant from the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, a foundation whose own mission is to foster wide-ranging, open, and public discussions about free societies and liberty. The Koch lecturers so far this year, Harold James, John Yoo, Brad Gregory, have addressed the foundations, preconditions, and futures of free societies. Their talks have been provocative and, I gather, controversial. We can expect nothing less tonight from tonight's speaker, Carlos Eire. Eire comes to us from Yale University, where he's the T. Lawrison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies. Before taking up his position at Yale, he taught at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota for 2 years, and for another 15 at the University of Virginia. His footnoted works of scholarship concern religion and society in early modern Europe, and he's written award-winning books on iconoclasm, attitudes towards death, and most recently, A Very Brief History of Eternity. If his formal scholarship earned Eire his position at Yale, his memoirs have earned him even wider acclaim and a wider reading audience. Indeed, he won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2003 for his memoir, The Cuban Revolution, Waiting for Snow in Havana. While his latest book, Learning to Die in Miami, recounts his early life in the United States as an exile from Cuba. It's upon his most recent book that Eire will speak tonight. At one level, Learning to Die in Miami is the entertaining story of one Pedro Pan boy, alone in America, waiting for his parents to join up with him and his brother. At another level, though, the book shows a first-rate historian grappling with many of the central problems and contradictions of Western civilization. The island nation in which he was born and from which he is now in exile was shaped by European colonization and immigration, both voluntary and forced, from across the Atlantic world. The peoples of that nation, Cuba, have also, for over half a century, suffered from the forced imposition upon them of one of the West's most pernicious intellectual products, totalitarianism in its Marxist and Leninist variant. Some, like Eire, fled to this republic, whose own intellectual origins run deep into the West's history. The United States provided a safe harbor, as Eire shows, but not one without its own challenges and contradictions. But what's most interesting to me, at least, about Learning to Die in Miami is that it's not republicanism, either in its classical or Madisonian forms, but a late medieval devotional book that helped Eire to make sense of his past, his present, and his future. Before putting him on the airplane to Miami, his parents gave him a copy of Thomas Kempis's Imitation of Christ, a 15th century Christian devotional guide that itself quietly channels ancient Greek and Roman philosophical traditions. He who follows me walks not in darkness, the book opens. The path out of darkness, Kempis argues, and Eire does himself, is not through conquest, but through submission, but a wholly different kind of submission from that imposed on Cuba or preached in America. I'll leave him to tell that story, but I hope you'll join with me in welcoming you here tonight to Ohio University. Carlos Eire.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for being here on this lovely Thursday evening when sitting outdoors is so tempting. Thank you. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here with you for several reasons. First and foremost, to see Robert again, who sat in my classes at the University of Virginia. And secondly, because one of my best friends went to school here, got his PhD here in psychology back in the late 60s. He was always talking about how wonderful Athens was, wonderful this university was, and now finally I get to be here, so thanks. And what I plan to do is to talk for about 40 minutes and then open it up for questions. But first, before I say anything else, for those of you who need a little filling in on the story, and I'm sure it's 99.9% of you, a little history about how I came to the United States. Between December of 1960 and October 1962, 14,068 Cuban children came to the United States unaccompanied. I'm one of them. Our parents put us on planes, commercial flights, and sent us to the U.S. because they felt they had no other choice. They knew we may never see each other again. They knew that was a real possibility. Of course, the plan everyone made when making this choice was to reunite with the children, either here in the United States or back in Cuba. The reason children were sent, and children were sent in such high numbers, is very complex. The practical side of it was adults need visas. Adults need security clearances, especially at the height of the Cold War. Children do not need security clearances. So, very complicated story, and if you want in the question and answer period, I'll answer questions about that. The U.S. State Department commissioned 3 Cubans in Havana to issue visa waivers to children. Run them off on a mimeograph machine, even though it said U.S. Department of State. These forms are being cranked out in Cuba. 14,000 children is only the tip of the iceberg. When the program ceased abruptly in October of 1962 due to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think almost, is there anyone here in this room who has not heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis? I don't expect a single hand to go up. The world came this close to blowing up. I have met, in some of my talks, men, two of them, who were in submarines and had already drilled numerous times to push the button. And they were expecting that to happen. This ends the airlift because when Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet premier, pulls the missiles out of Cuba, Fidel Castro, the ruler of Cuba, gets very angry, and one of his responses is to close the door and not allow anyone to leave. So our parents are trapped in Cuba and can't leave, and the Cuban government will not allow our parents to leave. But when the door slammed shut in October of 1962, there were 80,000 other children waiting to leave. So we're talking about almost 100,000 children in an island that had a population of only 6 million. I failed trigonometry in high school. I'm not good at math. You do the math. You all got in here to Ohio University. You can do the math. It's a huge percentage of the children of Cuba whose parents were not just willing but eager to get them out of there. And the question hanging over this is, why would any parent think that? I'll come back to that. This book, Learning to Die in Miami, which I was not supposed to write because I'm a historian of late medieval and early modern Europe, tells the story of my coming to the U.S. and my adjustment to life in the U.S. It's basically an immigrant story, but as Robert told you, it's more than that. The depressing title, Learning to Die in Miami, which the AARP was very excited about, the American Association of Retired People, thought, oh, wow, and they immediately contacted me and put me on one of their radio shows, and then they were greatly disappointed to find out, it's not about retirees going to die in Florida. It has to do with the fact that every immigrant, child, male, female, adult, old person, every immigrant has to die and become a new person. Pretty simple, but also very complex proposition. I'm going to read to you a little bit from the book, just so that you get the flavor of what the book sounds like. And I'm going to talk about that critical period, October 1962, the missile crisis. The world comes this close to disappearing. the world as we know it. One of those men from the submarines told me, you know what was weighing heaviest on our consciences was that we were going to kill everyone on Earth and we would survive. And they were that convinced it was going to happen. I couldn't have cared less at the time. My mother had an exit permit for November 7th. I was going to be reunited with her. Plus, Halloween was coming up. We didn't have Halloween in Cuba. We didn't celebrate Halloween. And I thought it was the most marvelous thing, a holiday in which the U.S. Constitution gave children the right to vandalize other people's homes. I couldn't wait. Actually, I wanted every doorbell not to be answered so that I could wreck someone's house. I was just overwhelmed with it. But I am in school in Florida, Everglades Elementary School. I'm in 6th grade. I had spent a few months after my arrival in a classroom where all we did all day long was learn English. The whole point of us being in that classroom was to mainstream us. None of this bilingual crap. Learn English, go to class with all the other kids, become an American. But I have problems. I thought that the actor Desi Arnaz spoke perfect English. If you've never seen the show I Love Lucy, you're a little lost, but he had a very thick accent. Lucy, you have some explaining to do. I thought that was perfect English. So in class, I'm teased for my accent and other things, but I have other experiences. And I'm going to read to you from shortly before Halloween, 1962. Teach me how to swear in Spanish. I can't add up how many times I've had this request already. Everyone wants to learn all the bad words in Spanish, even the girls. This puts me in a tight spot, for uttering bad words is against the first commandment and an entry ticket to hell. So, if I teach bad words to anyone, I'm endangering not only my eternal fate, but also theirs. And that makes my sin doubly worse. And if I say nothing, they'll just keep pestering me. I tried that, and I know that silence won't work. Plus, if I refuse, I'll be totally uncool, worse than a nerd. What's a boy to do? Toss them a bone, maybe. Remolacha, I say. What's that? Ooh, it's a Spanish word for sex, you know. The really dirty word with the F. Oh, give me more. Okay, how about this? Méteme una patada en las nalgas. What's that? Oh, it means go have sex with yourself, you know, the other version of the big bad F word. Thanks, Charles. Thanks a lot. This is great. I was Charles. I immediately became Charles. And then later when I moved to the Midwest, to the real Midwest, the flat Midwest, Bloomington, Illinois, I very quickly became Charlie and Chuck. Thanks, Charles. Thanks a lot. This is great. I don't tell him what I just taught him to say is the Spanish word for the vegetable beet and kick my butt. In class, very early in the fall term, teacher asks a question. I raise my hand and calls on me. And I say about the question, that's easy. And everyone starts laughing at me, laughing uproariously and making fun of me. For the remainder of my time at that school, I become Easy Boy. I thought I had said easy, but of course, you know, it's kind of hard to get that brain-tongue connection when you're learning a language. So I set myself to the task of learning English perfectly and speaking without an accent. And I focus on 2 television shows that have perfect English, the most beautiful English I have ever heard. The Beverly Hillbillies and the Andy Griffith Show. And later when I moved to Chicago, people will ask me, are you from the South? And I'll say, you have no idea how far south. So I go trick-or-treating. I don't demolish any homes, but I do perform my tricks. Along the way, I experience a lot of teasing for my accent. Also, some real-world cruelty, such as the day that I come out and I find my bike has been totally destroyed, simply because I am who I am and come from where I come from. And in the meantime, the missile crisis is unfolding, and I couldn't care less. I'm looking forward to Halloween. And by the way, I am living in a home run by this wonderful couple, married couple, Louis and Norma Chait. They have 2 little children, adopted, one 2 years old, one just in his months. They're Jewish, and I'm Catholic. I thought I had it made living with a Jewish family because I thought for sure I'm not going to go to church again. But they forced me to go to church and gave me money to put into the collection plate. American values? You can't find a better shorthand for summation of American values than what this family did for me. But I'll continue reading. My 12th birthday is approaching, less than a month after Halloween. I know I won't get a bar mitzvah, but I'd sure like to have one a year from now. That would make everything all right, even if I have to wear one of those stupid little caps that refuse to stay put on the back of your head. That ritual might even cure me of my accent and give me one more chance to go out on Halloween, because I won't be a man yet. I'll still be a boy next year, but a boy nonetheless, with 3 weeks to spare. My birthday's in November. Hey, Charles, what's the bad word of the day? Give me a really bad one this time. Really, really bad. Berenjenas. Eggplants. What's that? It's a very nasty... I'll use my accent. It's a very nasty way of saying breasts. Yow! How about one more? Me encantaría saborear tu flema. I'd love to savor your phlegm. That sounds even worse. What is it? It's a very bad way of saying I love to kiss you all over. Thanks, Charles. You Cubans have such dirty minds. Thanks. You bet. It's easy for us. It's all we can do in our grass huts, you know. What? Vete al carajo, cabrón. Go to hell, you bastard. Say what? Nothing, never mind. I know I've just bought myself an entry ticket to hell, especially since I've stopped going to confession. But I don't give a damn. Hell, I don't give a flying remolacha. Somehow, in some half-assed way, I've figured out that heaven and hell intersect all the time here in Miami. So I end up at Yale teaching late medieval and early modern history. For most of my adult life, I tried to get away from this as much as I could. I buried it all, buried it as deeply as possible. As a matter of fact, my interest in, let's say, 1400 to 1700 European history, the second choice. My first choice was ancient history, because it would get me even farther away from Cuba and my own past. But I didn't have the time or the money to learn 3 more languages, ancient languages, given the fact that I already had to learn Latin, French, German, and Italian. It all came out. All of this stuff that I had repressed. And I think, if any of you are immigrants, or the children of immigrants, even grandchildren of immigrants, and you've heard the stories, you know what it's like. And usually the children of immigrants make every effort, my children included, to hide their immigrantness, the nearness of that other country to their identity. I tried to bury it all and hide it, but you can't. This is the main message in the book, is that you are who you are, and you have to come to terms with who you are, no matter how painful it is. Now, the real pain for me was not the story of the airlift, not the fact that I left my parents behind and every relative, not the fact that I never, ever saw my father again because the Cuban government would not allow him to leave. It took 3.5 years for my mom to finally make it to the U.S. It's not that was painful. I hid the fact that I was Cuban because every time I did, especially in my profession, in academics, in this environment, 9 times out of 10, the person who found out I was Cuban would then proceed to tell me how wonderful the Cuban Revolution had been, or was. And I didn't want to get into an argument. I didn't want to have an unpleasant occasion. Somehow, the history that Americans had, especially Americans in academia, is very different from the history I knew. Extremely different. To me, the only difference between the Third Reich and Fidel Castro's Cuba is the scale of the killing. But it's a totalitarian state that runs itself on exactly the same principles as Nazi Germany. It doesn't have the racial fixation, but it has a class fixation. And those who are of the wrong class get treated the same way that the unwantables were treated in the Third Reich. At one point in the 1970s, Cuba was filled with concentration camps. I bet most of you don't know this. In the mid-70s, Cuba had a higher percentage of its total population in prisons and concentration camps than Stalin's Soviet Union ever did. If you didn't think like the government, you didn't think like the elites, the very few elites who ran the island with their Marxist ideology, which was a cover simply for their desire to be in power, too bad for you. This is why our parents got us out. That's why they sent us out. Some of you may already be thinking, oh, but they have free health care and free education. This is always the cover story. It's not free, and it's not good. And the way in which it is obtained, you all know the phrase, the end justifies the means, or the end doesn't justify the means. The price Cubans pay for their so-called free health care and free education is extremely high, and it's a price that I bet that not one of you in this room would want to pay, which is you don't have the freedom to think for yourself, you don't have the freedom to speak your mind, and you don't even have the freedom to own your home or sell anything that you have to your neighbor. I know a woman who received a 10-year prison sentence for selling her ration of meat to a neighbor. Total control. That's what the elites in Cuba are after and have been after for 52 years. The so-called free education, it's not free. Every child has to go to school. And they're told repeatedly, we're educating you for free. But they're also forced to spend almost the entire summer working in the fields as agricultural laborers for no pay whatsoever. And I don't care what your definition of slavery is. Mine is, if you work and you don't get paid, you're a slave. So, the free education is paid for by slave labor, slave child labor. The free health care, forget about it. It's terrible. And they have 2 tiers, one for the elites, one for everyone else. If you saw Michael Moore's Sicko, who saw that film? Anybody here? You know the hospital he goes to in Cuba? That's the party hospital. That's the one for the elites. Everyone else gets a whole level of dismal care. And God help you if you have to go to the hospital. Because if you don't have a family that can bring you food or sheets or soap or pay for the medications, too bad for you. But I digress. This is why our parents sent us here. They didn't want us to grow up in this kind of place. Plus, already in 1960 and 1961, they were already losing their children. They're losing their children to these agricultural labor camps, to literacy campaigns where they would send teenagers out in the countryside, force teenagers to go in the countryside to teach peasants how to read. And the Castro regime made a big deal out of this. Oh, look, we're teaching Cubans how to read. I hate to break the news to you, but I've looked at the 1960 census. And in Cuba, the literacy rate was higher than in several American states. And I won't mention which ones they are. But the literacy rate in Cuba was close to 80% when Fidel Castro took over. There were remote areas in the countryside where people were illiterate, yes. But at that very same time here in the United States, there were areas with even higher illiteracy. Cuba was not a third world nation. It was ruled by a dictator, yes, a corrupt dictator. Kind of like the Daley family in Chicago, with a little more muscle. But it wasn't a totalitarian regime. Our parents wanted to rescue us from this. Also, any child, still to this day, any child who goes to church or receives religious instruction of any kind can forget about an education past the age of 16. The so-called free education ends for you, because they don't want anyone who believes in anything other than the revolution. So our parents sent us here. And then all 14,000 of us got scattered to 40 different states. Just like this, see a show of hands if anyone here before today had heard of Operation Pedro Pan and the 14,000 children. Look, just the hand. It happened and nobody noticed. And no one noticed because we came in dribs and drabs, all 14,000, and we got scattered to the four winds. 40 different states, always in tiny little groups. My story, related in this book, shorthand as follows. Went to a camp where they processed us. My brother and I landed. He went to one camp, I went to a different camp. Then he went to one foster family, and I went to a different foster family. Then our foster families decided painfully that they couldn't keep us after the missile crisis because they had brought us in kind of like exchange students for just a few months. And now, after the door was closed, there was no end in sight, and they weren't prepared to keep us. Family I lived with lived in a tiny house, very tiny house. They couldn't keep me. So, my brother and I get sent to a home for juvenile delinquents. Not because we had broken the law, but that was the only place. And then we fell through the cracks, and they forgot we were there. We were supposed to be sent to live with an uncle who had arrived at the very last minute and had been resettled in Bloomington, Illinois. But they forgot about us, forgot about our uncle. One day the social worker comes into our wonderful home and says, "What are you kids doing here? You're supposed to be with your uncle." Within 3 weeks, we were living with our uncle. And that was wonderful. And then 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days later, our mom finally rejoined us, and we were moved to Chicago, where a social worker said to us on our second day in Chicago, he's addressing my brother and me, not our mom. He says, "You boys, your mom's never going to find a job because she doesn't speak English. She's physically handicapped." She had polio as a child. And she doesn't have any job skills, so it's up to you boys to maintain the household. Turns to my brother, who is all of 17, and says, you're old enough to drop out of high school. Do that. Drop out. Work full time. Turns to me and says, Oh, it's too bad you're too young. How old are you? I said, 15. Too bad you can't drop out of high school. Here's what you should do then. Go to high school during the day and work full-time at night, which is what I did. Repeat that 14,000 times over. That's what happened to all of us in one way or another. And for most of us who left on this airlift, we have 2 birthdays. We have our real birthday, and then we have the day we arrived in the U.S. But then we have another date that most of us don't like to think about, which is the date when we were reunited with our parents and had to take care of them. Or if we didn't have to take care of them, imagine this. Most of you are close enough in age to teenagerhood. Imagine spending most of your teenage years without a parent, in most cases with a lot of freedom, and suddenly your parents show up. Oh my God, tell me what to do. Yeah, so multiply that 14,000 times. I'm leading up to this point. What possessed me after burying all this and becoming an expert in late medieval and early modern history to write about this life? I couldn't help it. I couldn't help it. Events forced this story out of me. My first memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, was written in the year 2000. I wrote it in 2.5 months, every night, between 10 p.m. and 4 or 5 a.m. I was teaching summer term, so I'd write at night, go teach summer term, chair a department, come home, read what I had written the night before to my children, send them to bed, and then write some more. I had to. Why? Because in late 1999, early 2000, a little boy showed up off the coast of Florida all by himself, Elian Gonzalez, and he awakened in me every memory I had repressed. But even more important, what I saw being reported in the news media, in no way, shape, or form showed any awareness of real history, of the history I had lived through. Most Americans are saying, oh, of course the boy needs to be with his father. Send him back. I knew, and all 2 million Cuban exiles knew, the boy was not going to be sent back to his father. And he wasn't. Plus, all of us knew that this claim the Cuban government was making, oh, every boy needs to be with his father, was totally hypocritical because hundreds of thousands of us had been separated from our parents by that very same government. A government that not only could not give a damn, but actually made that one of their policies. And how can I get away with saying this, that I know that it was one of their policies? Well, divine providence, pure chance. We get a lot of speakers at Yale. One day we get a speaker. His name is Carlos Franchi. He was once Fidel's Minister of Propaganda. He was purged from the Cuban Communist Party in 1968 and then spent the rest of his life in Puerto Rico. But he came to speak to us about something else. But I got to have dinner with him, and I sat right next to him. And this is someone in Fidel's inner circle. So I asked him, you guys knew about the kids leaving, right? He says, oh, of course we did. So why'd you let them leave? Why did you separate the parents and prevent the parents from reuniting with them? And his answer to me, and he knew who I was and what I had gone through, with a smile on his face, he says, because anything that would destroy the bourgeois family was music to our ears. So our parents were right. It's not an illusion. Our parents were right. This was a fiendish kind of government, the kind I hope never, ever takes root in this country. This boy, Elian Gonzalez, made me realize that that boy stood not just for me, but for every Cuban. Because any way you turned with him, if you returned him to his father, he was screwed. If you kept him here in the United States with that crazy family in Miami, he was screwed. He had seen his mother drown, for heaven's sakes. His life was messed up, any way you turn. Same thing for me, same thing for every Cuban. Same thing for everyone who lives in Afghanistan and any unlucky place on earth where things are not as good as they are here. I wrote to every newspaper, every magazine, on my fancy Yale stationery, saying, please, 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 do a story on the airlift. Do a story on the forced labor camps where the fathers were sent, separated from their families and the children. I didn't get a single acknowledgement of any one of my letters. Not one. Not one. Thank you, we've received your letter. Not one. That's when I found out how prestigious my position at Yale really was. So I did the next best thing. I went nuts. I went crazy. And I wrote the first memoir, which I wrote as fiction. I sold it as fiction. I passed it off as a novel. But then my editor caught on to the fact it was a memoir, and it was then published as nonfiction. Thank God and thank my editor, Rachel Clayman, a very smart woman who went on to edit Barack Obama's The Audacity of Hope. She told me, look, this has to be published as nonfiction because if your whole point is to awaken your readers to the reality of what was going on in Cuba, and they have to keep asking, did this really happen? Then it won't have the same effect. If they know that this happened to a real person and that you're that person speaking, well, then it'll have an effect. And God, bless her, it did. It did. That book has done exactly what I hoped it would do. But I committed a grave mortal sin as an academic. I wrote about myself. I wrote without research. I wrote without footnotes. And that's the last thing we're supposed to do. For those of you that don't know, there are certain standards in professorship. You have to prove you're serious. You have to prove you're committed to what you're doing. My very best friend came up for tenure. He was a year behind me. This is at the University of Virginia. This is my first glimpse of the world behind the curtain, kind of like in The Wizard of Oz. Comes up for tenure, and the very first words out of the mouth of one of my idiot colleagues is, we can't tenure this man. He's not serious. Look, he's published poetry. And not just bad poetry, but good poetry in great poetry journals. But there's a standard in academia that if you veer the least bit from your profession, then you're not serious. And I did that. And I did it. I felt I was free falling without a parachute as I was writing this book, but I couldn't have cared less because I felt I had to bear witness to a history that people don't know about. And it's not just a history that people don't know about, it's a history that most Americans know in a very twisted and perhaps even backwards way. So, as a historian, I use the power of narrative to entice the reader to follow a story and see the eyewitness account. And here is where my talk gets a little bit technical, but I think it's fine. I need to do this. What's the difference between writing from memory, if you're the eyewitness to an event, and writing from documents 2, 3, 4, 500 years after the event? It's a big difference. Yes, it's a big difference. Those of us who work on the distant past, or even, something that happened 50 years ago, we have documents. Other people's testimony, we put them together. Writing from memory, somewhere in here, all of us have the past. And it's the greatest miracle. The great Christian thinker and theologian, St. Augustine, in the 4th, 5th century, wondered in his book, The Confessions. He was really puzzled by this. Where is the past? Why is it I can remember the past if it's no longer here? Where is it? Where is that past? And he went further and he said, there really isn't any present. If you say the word now, by the time you get to the last letter, it's no longer now. So what he said was, all we have is the past. We don't know what the future is. The present is always moving. So memory, he concludes, is all we are. Now, if you've been an eyewitness to something, and you constantly encounter people who know nothing about it, or actually tell you that your experience is not true, it could drive you crazy. Memory is faulty. You can't trust memory 100%. I use first-person accounts in my work from 500 years ago. I've always thanked these people, but I've also said, I can't trust you. People who write about themselves have a tendency to make themselves look better, to hide things, to emphasize other things, and so on. As happened with Oprah's author, forget his name, Million Little Pieces, who made himself look a lot better. I skipped that temptation by writing a novel. See, I had no intention of publishing my memoir as a memoir. I begged the author to take all the unpleasant stuff out, but she said, no way. The more unpleasant you seem, the more real you will be. And she was right. Memory skips a few beats, but there is nothing that gets you to the past more directly than memory, and especially an eyewitness account, and especially an eyewitness account of a great injustice. Because that's what has happened in Cuba for the past 52 years, and for the 50 years before that, too. Great injustice, repeatedly. But the earlier injustices pale in comparison to the injustice that has been in place for the last 52 years, a totalitarian regime that tries to control everyone in the most minute way. Case in point, only 1.7% of the population of Cuba has access to the internet. And that's not because of poverty. It's because the government will not allow people to have access to the internet. And here's the silliest one. Not even Franz Kafka could come up with this. In an island, no one has access to boats except those who have a special government license, because they don't want anyone to escape. It is illegal for Cubans to travel out of Cuba unless the government gives them a special permission. Imagine that. Even more silly. Not really silly, but cruel. It is illegal for Cubans to move from one location to another without government permission. Imagine that. If you speak out against an injustice by bearing witness to it, you prevent it from continuing. You prevent it, perhaps, from happening again. So here's my ethical quandary as a historian of the distant past. I can speak to recent history. I can speak to the here and now. I can bear witness to an unjust regime and to the history of those who fled from it. And many have fled. Here's another startling statistic. Population of Cuba right now is 11 million. 2 million are in exile. That's 20% of the population. In the same time that 2 million Cubans have fled, not one single person has moved to Cuba to live in Cuba, except for people fleeing their crimes elsewhere. I know many Haitians who fled from Haiti to Cuba thinking Cuba would be a better place, and they were immediately sent back to Haiti. You bear eyewitness to an injustice, you might bring it down. And that's what I'm trying to do in a very, very small way. Risking my professional status and risking it in a big way. And I'll leave you with this anecdote, because this is the historian's craft. It really is something of a science. For the past few hundred years, we have discerned certain rules of how you reconstruct the past. There are many fewer rules for writing from memory. And our memory does make mistakes. So I'm taking two risks. I'm writing about myself, and I'm writing from memory. But I think it's necessary for me to do that. I'll give you an example of the way in which memory fails, and it's an extreme example. In my first memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana, I say in the last chapter that not a single one of my friends came to say goodbye at the airport. Well, lo and behold, the book is published. 2003 and 2004, I hear from some guy whose name I vaguely recognize, Miguel Sales Figueroa. Miguelito, yes. We meet up, of all places on earth, in Paris, because I've gone to Paris for a conference. First thing he asks me, do you remember me being at the airport? And I'm very embarrassed. I say, no, I'm sorry, I don't. I do remember that time we got into a fight and I hit you and you fell back and hit your head on the telephone pole and both of us started crying. And then he said, well, I don't remember that. Thank you for making me remember. Then he said, it's so strange that you should not remember me being at the airport because that was the day that changed my life and that was my first step towards prison. Up until that point, Miguel, who's exactly my age, had not thought about whether the revolution was good or bad. His father ran a butcher shop, and he had to pay rent to a landlord. Suddenly, his father didn't have to pay rent because there was no private property. So as far as Miguel's family was concerned, a good thing had happened. Eventually, the government would shut down Miguel's father's butcher shop because that's what states do with businesses. But anyway, Miguel told me, it was at that moment in the airport seeing your family split up that I started to think that maybe this wasn't a good thing. Why would families be separated this way? First step towards prison, it started him to thinking, it started him to opposing this totalitarian regime. And by age 18, he's in prison and would spend 8 years in prison for saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. Moment changed his life, I can't even remember. But he described the event in such great detail to me that I know he was there. He even told me who rode in which car to the airport. So I know he was there, but my memory didn't take that in. Does that make my memoir false or bad? No. It actually, this little bit adds a little more, you know. We see what matters to us the most. I was saying goodbye to my family. I was his first friend to leave, and he was watching me leave. But that shows you memory is faulty. But anyway, I'll end with this anecdote, also from that same week at that conference in Paris. I'm now at a crossroads and have been at a crossroads for a number of years because my history books take 10 years apiece to write. And, you know, our time on earth is limited. And I'm watching the clock. And if my books take 10 years to write, and I'm now 60, how many more books do I have left in me? These memoirs, I wrote one in not even an entire summer. I wrote the second one in 8 weeks. They just come out, poof. And they have a much greater impact. I've received thousands of letters and emails thanking me for the memoirs. No one ever thanked me for my scholarly books. They did get me a wonderful job, and that's wonderful. But no one thanks you. Your readers don't thank you. So, I'm at this conference. We're having dinner after I have given my paper, and I thought it was a damn good paper on a subject I'm sure all of you would be thrilled to read about. You're going to run out after this lecture and seek down this article on the translation of late medieval devotional texts into vernacular languages in the early 16th century. Yes, very hot topic. Tomorrow I'll be on Oprah talking about that subject. I thought my paper was okay. It's good. So we're at dinner and having conversation. Someone with very bad manners says to the table. By the way, do you know Carlos won the National Book Award in the United States? Well, for what? What? Nobody knows, because they're all academics. They don't know about my memoirs. So I have to explain what the book is about, and everyone looks really crestfallen. Guy sitting directly across from me, and I have competed for jobs with him my entire career and gotten the jobs that he didn't get. Looks at me with a very pained expression. Says, "Oh, you know what that means, don't you?" I said, "No, tell me, what does it mean?" He says, "You're going to be remembered for that book, not for your work as a historian." I said, "I can live with that." Then the French historian who organized the conference put it all in perspective for me, and that's the quandary I find myself in. As only a French historian can, without missing a beat, he said, well, you certainly won't win a prize for the paper you gave us today." So there I am, and there you are, and, you know. Postscript. That paper I won't win a prize for was eventually published. It's the only scholarly work for which I have received thank yous. I think something spilled over from the memoir writing to the scholarly writing, so I'm not exactly between a rock and a hard place, but you know, I think on the whole, we historians try to reconstruct the past. We need to focus more on those details, you know. Architect Mies van der Rohe had it right. God is in the details, and this applies to everything. It's those little details. If we can capture the past and revivify it in all its complexity, then we'll start getting thank you letters. If you stand up and speak out and bear witness to injustice, you won't get thank you letters from everyone. You will get thank you letters, but you'll also get hate mail, which I get some of. Google my name, Carlos Eire, and Satan. You'll get to a website. So, thank you all for your patience.
Question for Satan.
Yes.
Your parents, I was listening to the BBC 2 days ago, and they were talking about Cuba.
Right.
There was a correspondent in Cuba whose hard-hitting, tough question to the Cuban official whom he was interviewing was, how do you account for your world-famous healthcare? And of course, this is a widely spread view.
Right.
What was it? Why is it that the world has not learned that totalitarian states can actually hide an awful lot, first of all? And what was it about your parents that caused them to see, in what must have still been an incipient problem, the full-blown nature of what was going to happen so early on?
Well, that's a good question. But by 1961, which is when my parents began to seek out this visa waiver and make plans to have us leave, already children were being sent on these errands, these revolutionary errands. They were afraid they were losing us. The older children were being sent on even farther errands or to study in the Eastern Bloc Soviet satellites or in the Soviet Union. Plus, draft. Anyone over 18 had to go into the army. So they were afraid they were losing us. But you know, the draft and army thing doesn't explain the fact that so many of the Pedro Pan children were girls, or that the youngest was 3 years old. They were afraid they were losing us, and they felt they had a drastic choice to make. That system over there, which is totalitarian, or the United States, where they'll have freedom. And I know this sounds ridiculous to many people who have grown up in the United States, but throughout the world, There are many people who think that freedom is not an abstraction, but something very real. Americans take it for granted because it's like the air you breathe. You know, you can't see the air, so what? What's the question? What's the question until you're in a room where the air gets sucked out? And that's basically what our parents saw. They saw the air being sucked out, and they decided to send us here as a temporary measure, right? But knowing, as you know, when you take any medication and you have all those warnings, this may happen to you. If you take this medicine, your brain might explode. You take it, hoping it. And in most cases, the families were reunited, but after a long separation. Yes, in the orange.
My family's actually from Cuba, and I remember talking to my grandpa once. He's about 20 years older than me. And we were talking about his experience in Cuba and how he has very fond memories of pre-revolution and post-revolution things. Obviously went south, and my family obviously got out because I'm here. But I wonder, when I talk to my grandpa, he says he never wants to go back to Cuba because the way he remembers it is this very beautiful place and all these fond memories, and he doesn't want to see what it became. How do you feel about maybe going back to Cuba if, you know, Americans aren't allowed to go or anything?
I can't go right now.
Well, obviously, but if you could.
Right, if I could. But I'm on their enemies list. I'm not allowed to go by them. They will not let me go. All my books are banned at Cuba. If it changes, I'd love to go back and take a look. I wouldn't go back to live, I don't think. If in some way, shape, or form, some combination of events becomes clear to me that I can do something to help rebuild the place, I'll do that. But your grandfather is right. The gap between one's memories and what is there now is so immense. And I cannot look at photographs or films of present-day Cuba without being brought to tears or actually crying like a baby. I just can't because the destruction is like a neutron bomb leaves the buildings intact, but kills the people. And a reverse neutron, everything, all the infrastructure has been destroyed by that economy. People are destroyed. I can't. I couldn't watch the film when it was the social cost. After 10 minutes, I had to click it off. Couldn't take it. So I understand your grandfather. I go on Google Earth, fly over my house, fly over Havana, see how little has changed. There's virtually no new construction since 1958. I can recognize everything. That's as close as I get. It's the safest I can come. My house looks at the highest magnification, looks about that big. Yes. My father remained behind. I was never able to have an adult conversation with him. He died in 1976 when I was 25, suddenly a heart attack, but he'd had heart disease. He was he had retired at that point because of his heart disease. He had permission to leave, and he was making plans to leave, but he died. I have no idea what his life was like after we left. I've only gotten one glimpse, and this was a woman who read my book and emailed me and said, I knew your father. Your father rescued me from prison. She's the woman who sold the meat and got 10 years in prison. My father got her out. And she said, I went to your father's house to thank him in person. And now I'm very startled because now I find out that he had a family. He said nothing about you or about your mother. There are no photographs of you or your mother on any of the walls. You didn't exist. If people knew that you had family in the United States, you could be subjected to a certain amount of harassment. So I think he was, but that's all I know. He rescued a woman from prison, and he hid all pictures of us and all knowledge of us being in the United States from strangers. Phone calls were limited to 3 minutes apiece with someone listening on the other end. And once when my mother said to my father, "I miss you so much," the listener on the Cuban end started laughing. That's the kind of place it is and continues to be. Yes?
I'm kind of wondering a little bit about your mother's experience too, and when she came. And obviously, both of you being immigrants and your brother, you have some experiences in common as immigrants, but you also have very different experiences because you grew up
That's
both
right.
here as a child, and she came as an adult woman who had to leave part of her family behind. What kind of memories and stories did she have about Cuba? The good things that she wanted you to hang on to as you were becoming more American, learning how to die?
You know, it's not like she had this planned. You know, occasionally, as happens in every family, something would come up, usually something silly or funny from the past. It's not as if she had a list, "Oh, please, you know, before I die, I want you to remember this or that." No, something silly would come up, or, you know, something serious sometimes about things that had happened in the family and so on and so forth. But it was always little dribs and drabs here and there. And she had a wonderful way of never focusing on what she had lost. She never talked about that. I never once heard her complain about the fact that she had left her mother, father, brother, and sister, and husband to be with us. Never, ever. But she always did ask repeatedly, "Are you glad we sent you?" And then this is in Learning to Die, towards the end. About 2 weeks before she died, she asked me for the very first time, "Are you glad I came?" And I had to lie to her. I said, "Of course I'm glad." And that's not a 100% lie, as most of us who are old enough know. You know, life is complex, and you can have ambivalent, complex feelings. You know, when she came, my brother and I became her guardians for a while, and for any teenager, that's kind of a bummer. Oh, gee, you know. So, but yeah, I'm glad she came. But her life was very hard. Yeah. He never finished high school, and he had a series of menial jobs. However, my brother is immensely creative. He convinced Northwestern Business School that he not only had a high school degree, but also a college degree. And he went there for a semester and gave it up, became a computer programmer, did that for a few years, and then the switch came over. I still remember he worked in this computer room, about the size of this room was the computer, right? And then came the switch, and he just said, "Oh, you know, I don't want." So he went to work for American Airlines as the manager of the food service at O'Hare Airport for American Airlines. Then he hurt his back, and downward spiral. He retired disabled at age 45. And his life has not been too good ever since. But yeah, he didn't let the absence of a high school degree stop him from doing other things. He was also a dog catcher for a while. And among his many distinctions in the mid-1970s, number 2 parking ticket scofflaw in Chicago. He owed $70,000 in parking fines. And the city settled with him for $7,000. He knew how to deal with that because he had also been a bill collector. So he's an interesting guy. Took a completely different track. Yeah.
I would like to hear a little more about your moving from writing a novel to a memoir. What went on to persuade you to move from?
Well, it was my editor who insisted that what I had already written be published as memoir rather than fiction. I changed nothing. When I wrote my memoir, I wrote it as if I were writing a novel. Okay, I'll go through the steps. First night, it's early May 2000. I get this crazy idea in my mind, and I sit down and write a chapter. I got the first paragraph just fine, but then I'm having trouble making things up. So I get this crazy idea, I'll just write about my life and pass it off as fiction. Who's going to know? And I continued down that path. And I sold it. On the title page, it said, a novel. The original title was also not accepted. The original title for Waiting for Snow in Havana was Kiss the Lizard, Jesus. I don't know why they found it objectionable. But they did. So I suggested various other titles like Kiss the Lizard, Cuban Boy, and Kiss the Lizard this, Kiss the Lizard that. And they said, you don't understand, it's the lizard. It's a problem there. So I got angry, and I did what I do when I get angry. I turned in 250 titles to them. And the one they picked was Waiting for Snow in Havana. But I didn't change anything. And when I go to high schools, writing teachers get mad at me. Because when I'm asked, well, did you have an outline? I said, no outline. What about rewriting? And I say, none whatsoever. I sold my first draft. And the teachers get, we've spent years trying to tell these kids. But what I tell the high school kids then, if that comes up, it's like, those jugglers with chainsaws. It takes practice. Don't you try it. Don't try this at home. It takes a lot of practice. But I wrote the second one, fully conscious of the fact that it was going to be published as a memoir. But I wrote it in exactly the same way and same style as the first, as if my life were a novel. And that works, I think, to a great extent. Think of yourself as a fictional character. Think of everyone you know as a character in a novel. And life becomes a lot simpler. And actually, I think you get to the nub of the truth about yourself and other people. In the way, any great novelist can reduce a character to just a few lines, and you know that character, right? That's what I've tried to do in writing memoirs. Is find the nub and work with that. Yeah.
I think in an hour, you've done, I think for a lot of students here, more than I've ever done in trying to convince them that historians are human too. In that vein, what do you take to 16th century Spain? Right? I mean, what is it about Carlos Eire, right, that visits 16th century Spain? How does that shape the books you produced as an academic?
That's a great question. I now come to 16th century Spain as a different person after writing these memoirs, which is I have much less patience for the filler, so to speak. And by the filler, I mean going into great detail into all of those arguments that other people are going to make and challenge you on. And focus on the narrative. And sort of have the point of view that most micro-historians have, where they trust the story to reveal things to you without explaining it. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. I learned this first draft of Waiting for Snow in Havana. The one edit we had. My editor kept saying, show, don't tell. Because what I had done is I'd use a metaphor and then I'd explain it. And after a while, I knew exactly what she was going to say, take this out there. So I had to strangle the professor in Waiting for Snow. I had to choke let the metaphor speak for itself. But now in history, I think, let the details of the story, let the narrative draw the reader in. And then in the footnotes, that's our saving grace as historians, is what we can pack into footnotes. Those who are serious, those who want to challenge us in a scientific way, there it is. It's in the footnotes. But the main text, the narrative. Now every time I pick up a 600-page book, I feel like throwing it across the room. And I have a 600-page book. It doesn't have to be that long. It just doesn't. Get to the point. That's what I bring back. Before I wrote the memoirs, though, I had a life-transforming experience as a historian in Spain, working with wills. I was reading wills from the 16th century, last wills and testaments. The archive I was working in had no catalog, so I had to do my own cataloging. So I made a list by name and death date. And I spent weeks working on this list by death date. One night I have a dream. I'm looking at my list, and there is my name. Instantly woke up. Whether the date of my death was there or not, immaterial. I woke up in a total fright and with a totally different attitude towards those wills I was reading. They didn't want to die either. They didn't expect to have that date next to their name. These documents I'm reading are more than legal documents. So I started to look for the little things, like the woman who bequeathed her little dog to her neighbor. And I tried to put that into the very numerical, quantitative analysis. Or the priest who left his entire estate to be used for masses for his soul. And then inserted a paragraph in there. I managed to actually bring that in. He said in his paragraph, I know my family will challenge this, but I don't give a damn. This is my money. It's my soul. I've worked for it. So then, I started seeing things a little different, and now that's what I try to. And I have much less patience with a lot of books published lately in early modern that come straight out of dissertation to book. And all that unnecessary stuff is in there. A book should, for even the scholarly public, doesn't have to have all that level of detail in the text. Put it in the footnotes. Yes?
I'd like to know a little bit more about your experience as an American academic who outed himself as a visceral critic of Cuban communism, and how you would relate to colleagues or other people in the profession who maybe wax poetic about a system that, as you said, you bear witness and go testament against.
It's been hard. It's been hard. I haven't, experienced any total breakdown in communication with any of my colleagues at Yale. At Virginia, only about 3 people knew I was Cuban. At Yale, everyone knows, but I've had my unpleasant encounters. I've had unpleasant encounters in speaking engagements, other places too, with academics who have accused me of lying, actually. And even when I point, you can get this at this website, you can go here and see. Say, no, that's not true. Well, what do you do then? It's just I spent most of my life not avoiding this because it was painful. I didn't want confrontations. I didn't want unpleasantness. But after a certain point, and I think turning 50 had a lot to do with it, I said, maybe we need to have this unpleasantness. Maybe we need to have this confrontation. And, I don't know. Everyone in academics that I have met who has disagreed with me on this says, well, live and let live. Okay, let's not talk about this anymore. And we go on to talk about other things. But some straining has taken place there. And what people think of me, I no longer care. Some people think I'm, I guess, something of a neo-Nazi, just because I say that Cuban totalitarianism is bad. But my most unpleasant experience did not involve an academic. It's not just an academic. So I was giving a talk in Westport, Connecticut, at the public library. And after the talk, first hand up. First hand is always trouble. I forget who was first here tonight, but it wasn't that you weren't trouble. But usually the first hand sometimes is trouble. This man says, "Why are you defending Batista?" Batista's the man who was president before Fidel. I said, "I'm not defending Batista. Did you hear me mention his name?" I said, "If you'd read my book, I say in my book in many different ways what a cretin he was and how hated he was." And then through several steps, he gets to this point yelling at me. "You people are ruining this country. It's because of you people that we have George Bush as president. It's because of you people that we're in Iraq," and so on. Long list of our sins as conservatives. I did not want to tell him that one year, out of sheer frustration, I voted for Ralph Nader, because that would have made his head explode. But what he meant, he says, "Why don't you people either shut up or go back where you came from?" Then I look at his arm. He had a number tattooed on his arm. He was a Holocaust survivor. And normally it would take me 3 years to think of what to say, but it came to me. And I said, "Listen to yourself," talking about you people, making these generalizations. It's that kind of talk that got you in that cattle car towards Auschwitz in the first place. And then we had a very unpleasant exchange, and he turned his back and walked away. There are a lot of people who assume that if you're not in favor of the socialist workers' paradise in Cuba, somehow you're something like a Nazi or a neo-Nazi, responsible for all the evils in the United States because those few Cuban votes in Florida got George Bush elected. I should have told him I voted for Ralph Nader just to see what happened. Yeah.
What do you think the chances are of the Cuban people overthrowing government?
I think what happened in Egypt and what is happening in Libya, Syria, cannot happen in Cuba. Because in those other places, people have now internet communication and Twitter. And in Cuba, there is no net. Plus, there is very strong repressive network in place. Anyone who opposes the government is met with a government-organized crowd that attacks them and threatens them. That's what's been happening for the past few months, when a few people have tried to stand up. And of course, this doesn't make it to the news media. But this is the way repression works. Those people who join those mobs, they get more food. They get shoes for their children. This is how you get them to keep everybody down. Plus, as in any system, there are those who live off the system and live very well off the system, and they're the ones that keep everything. And no one has access to weapons except the military and the police. And the last time Cubans tried to march out on the street, which was in the 1990s in Havana, a whole group of people went out. The protests got crushed. People got thrown into prison, and that was that. So it's pretty hard for that to happen. What needs to happen, two things. The leadership dies, and they will die soon enough, because they're in their 80s and 70s. They can't rule for that long. Number two, the Cuban economy is a total disaster. Not because of the U.S. embargo, as they claim. There is no embargo. The U.S. is Cuba's fourth largest trading partner. Most of the food eaten in Cuba comes from the United States. Most people don't know this. Cuban economy is in shambles because of central planning, which is always a disaster. Over half the land is no longer being used. A country which used to export sugar to the entire world now imports sugar. The only thing keeping Cuba afloat economically is tourism. And the system that's in place can be described as apartheid. Tourists have access to food, services, stores, shops, entertainment that the natives don't have. And they're segregated from the natives. Last year, 2 million tourists, European and Canadian, went to Cuba. They're keeping the place afloat. How to end it? My estimate, in less than a year, have Cuba become the new South Africa. Back in the 80s, it became a social sin for anyone to visit South Africa because of apartheid. And suddenly artists weren't going to South Africa, tourists weren't going to South Africa, nobody was doing business with South Africa. At every college and university, students demanded that the university divest itself of investments in firms that did business with South Africa. Came crashing down like a house of cards. I don't know if this university or even my own has stock in Sherritt Mining from Canada. Sherritt does all the mining in Cuba. I don't know if this university or mine has stock in the Spanish hotel chain Meliá. They have a bunch of hotels. Or Sandals. Believe it or not, in Cuba they have Sandals and Beaches resorts. No tourists, no Castros. It's that simple. But I wrote a letter to President Obama before his inauguration saying, please, 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 make Cuba the new South Africa. Well, I got a form letter back. I didn't expect him to, but is it ethical to visit any place where people are being oppressed like that? Yes, if you're going to help the people, that's quite different. If you're going there to enjoy yourself, I can't tell you how many people have come up to me when they find out I'm Cuban and say, you know, I'd love to go there so I can see it now before it changes. No idea what effect that has. I've heard people say things like, I want to go to Cuba before they have Starbucks and McDonald's. My response is, oh, you'd like to visit the zoo. You like McDonald's, Starbucks. You like Walmart, but you don't want Cubans to have it. You want to see them without that stuff, like primitives that they are. So it's pretty hard for... I ask myself, what would I do if I were there? I don't know. But I know I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Pretty hard to stand up to some system like that. Yeah.
You mentioned after coming to America that you were forced into English-only education, and there was no such thing as bilingual education. At least in your circumstances, what would you say is the most significant way this has affected your time in America?
I'm a proselytizer, evangelist for mainstreaming, children especially. For adults, it's different, you know. It's very hard for adults to change languages. But children, up until puberty, our brains wire differently as we learn languages. So this is why it's so hard for anyone who learns a language after puberty to lose their accent. In my case, I was able, and this may seem trivial to you, perhaps not. A kid who has an accent in class is treated differently, no matter how smart he or she is. They're treated differently socially. The teacher has certain things that they might do to accommodate and so on and so on. So, little kids who grow up with a foreign accent, and I have met many of them, even at Yale, Hispanics who were born in this country and speak with a thick Hispanic accent. You know, it's different if somebody is a certain age and they have an accent, people can accept that. But kids, in order for them to be fully able to integrate themselves and compete, they need to have full command, including the accent. In my case, I think it opened all sorts of doors. Usually followed by, at the other end, when people found out who I was, is, oh, gee, I didn't know you were Cuban. But then people make certain kinds of assumptions about what a Cuban should or shouldn't do. And every time I meet someone in academics who doesn't know me, and I tell them my name, the usual response is, oh, you must be in the Spanish department, right? Then I say, no, I'm in the history department. Say, oh, you must do Latin American history. No, sorry. And then I had a colleague at Virginia who asked me once, came out full, asked me point blank, how did you ever get into such a Nordic subject as the German Reformation? Why not? The man who was asking me this question was a WASP from Maine who was an expert in African religion. He had no questions about how he got to his, but for me, I'm supposed to go into. So not having an accent too kind of, shields you from that. Well, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Major funding for the George Washington Forum is provided by the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, the Apgar Foundation, the Veritas Fund for Higher Education Reform, and the Thomas W. Smith Foundation. For more information, please visit us on the web at www.ohio.edu/Washington Forum. Thank you.